morning. Thanks for joining us for the second day of the 2019 Ashford University Research Symposium. I'm Dr. Peggy Sundstrom with the College of Doctoral Studies, and I'm here today to introduce you to our next speaker, Maryrose Blank, known affectionately to her friends as MR, so that's how I'm going to refer to her. MR earned her degree, her PsyD degree in 2018 through the University of the Rockies. She's been a mental performance coach working primarily with athletes in the military on cognitive enhancement for about the past 12 years. She's going to be talking about her dissertation research today, but you'll see there on the introductory slide, the Tier 1 Mindset is the new consulting firm that MR has recently begun since she completed her degree. So yay, graduates, they do great things, but it's a great website. So if you're interested in seeing what kinds of services MR offers to clients, take a look at that website. It's impressive. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce MR, and we'll look forward to your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Sundstrom. I really appreciate it. I want to first just thank you and the university for inviting me for this opportunity. I think it's just a great opportunity to share best practices, lessons learned in the field, and just exchange dialogue. And I look forward to future collaborations. So as Dr. S mentioned, primarily for the last better half of 12 years, I've been working primarily with the military. And so a lot of my work started at Fort Bragg, where I was working with 82nd Airborne soldiers, 18th Airborne Corps, and then the Special Operations community. And as the years started to tag on, this use of biofeedback technologies to enhance mental, emotional, and cognitive performance really started gaining traction in the field of sports psychology, primarily with the military. And so I found myself constantly looking to the research for ways to validate and measure the relationship between psychophysiological responses to stress and cognitive performance. And what I found was when I dug through the research, it was mainly with athletes. And as I started to go through my doctoral program with the University of the Rockies, and I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do my dissertation on? It would have been probably a lot easier to go through that athletic database and say, okay, I'm going to do it on this topic and, work with athletes. But with my work with the soldiers, I found really my purpose and my calling to expose the military and really find ways to research these concepts to enhance the research done with this population. And so I start with the why piece because I think it's so important whenever you're starting a new project or whenever you're doing something that you're passionate about to really dig deep and figure out, hey, why am I doing this? and why is it important to me, and how could it benefit the population I serve and have some impact? And I think that's the biggest thing, is why I start with that, is it really provided me with the motivation and the purpose to start this process. You'll see in these pictures here, both at 82nd Airborne, right here with this young sniper, all the way up until, my work here in Northern Virginia with military free fall. These soldiers are all using these types of technologies to measure the stress response and looking for a cutting edge to be their best when it matters most. And one of the most important soft truths, SOF standing for Special Operation Forces, is humans are more important than hardware. So we want to train the human capital, the human capacity, and so that's where really this research took off, and for me and my why. The topic is, what is the relationship between heart rate variability and cognitive performance? And heart rate variability, or HRV, is basically a non-invasive way to measure the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is comprised of two subsystems, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. When someone is balancing their fight or flight response and their rest and digest system, that person has strong autonomic self-regulation. They're better adaptable. They sleep better. They have lower blood pressure. Cortisol levels tend to, level out and be closer to baseline. They're less susceptible to depression. They're able to focus and concentrate and memorize information more clearly. Someone with lower heart rate variability is the opposite of those things. And so this non-invasive way is comparable to taking somebody's cortisol level. And so it's a really great assessment tool, but also an ability to train somebody, because it's trainable, it's adaptable, and can be modified over time. So performance-based populations that are currently using this, the athletic environment, definitely. The military is always looking at this return on investment. And so that's really where we were looking at is, hey, what's the relationship between HRV and cognitive performance, and how could we validate this return on investment? You'll see in this chart here, the military is spending, the government spends a lot of money with the military in terms of budget, $679 billion, 59% of that budget. And so if we can, the bottom line is, if we can enhance the health and sustainability of service members and make them more sustainable over the lifespan of their careers, we spend less money training new people to do really tough jobs. And so that's this whole idea of this preservation of the force, looking at someone's heart rate variability, looking at their cognitive performance over time, and seeing what, if any, relationship exists. So the study involved a purposive sample of 36 participants. The goal was 35. I was able to get 36. The research design was a quantitative correlational design. We used Pearson's correlation to look at the relationship between heart rate variability, HRV, and cognitive performance. The biofeedback device that was used was Zephyr Technologies, and the cognitive performance assessment program was Cogstate. We also did a t-test to assess the differences between males and females. And then we looked at a two-way ANOVA to observe the variations in heart rate variability across testing conditions, while also looking at a possible interaction effect. The data collection process took a total of around 70 minutes, and that included the time up front required for the informed consent, the ID number to be issued, an information form that looked at some basic demographics to include age, gender, sleep quality and quantity, the level of physical activity per week, and then just a qualifications check. And the qualifications check looked at minimizing any sort of confounding variables that are most well known in the research when looking and assessing heart rate variability. And those factors include caffeine, alcohol, heart rate affecting drugs, any sort of physical exercise like right before an HRV baseline, and then if you're pregnant. Okay, so the window that we used, given, again, the research in this area, was 12 hours. So participants were told ahead of time, no caffeine, alcohol, if you're on heart rate affecting drugs, you're not allowed to participate in the study, and no PT or no physical training. After the bioharness demonstration and signal check, we began the three-phase protocol. And that involved capturing a 10-minute HRV baseline, using a tilt test of supine resting for 5 minutes, and then sitting upright for 5 minutes. Following the baseline, that individual engaged in cognitive performance testing while being monitored in terms of their HRV. And that was roughly around a 40-minute time period to take those 10 cognitive tests. And then following the cognitive performance testing, the individual engaged in HRV recovery phase, phase 3, which mimicked the baseline. Only one participant was able to be tested at a time, given the nature of some of the cognitive tests. There were times where I needed to interact with the participant, read a list out loud, and they had to back brief me what they remembered from that information. So it was really impossible to test more than one participant at a time. So a summary of the findings. In terms of the correlational tests that were conducted, there were no statistical significant correlations or relationships that existed between the two variables, HRV and cognitive performance test scores. And that includes all three phases, the baseline, the testing, and the recovery. In terms of the t-test analysis that we did, Across the board, in terms of all three phases, women had a lower HRV compared to men in each phase. And the t-test revealed that it was statistically significant, these differences in phase 1 HRV baseline between males and females. For the other two phases, there was no statistical significance. The two-way ANOVA, that one did indicate that the testing conditions varied across time. So as expected, that during cognitive testing, HRV was suppressed and went down, but there was no interaction effect present between HRV and gender. And that level was at p.06. It indicated a possible trend. So if there was a larger sample, if there was more females, compared to males, or a similar spread, that might have potentially been shown to be significant. But right now, it's just indicating a trend. I think it's important to note that the current sample's HRV baseline in general, both for males and females, was higher compared to the normative data that we see on heart rate variability. So the normative data, the average heart rate variability baseline for individuals is 50 plus or minus 16, okay? But this current sample that we were looking at, the males average was 115 and the females was 80. So it really, when you look at this sample compared to the general population, their heart rate variability was higher, better, stronger by a landslide, really, compared to the general population. And then also that was the case for 4 out of the 8 cognitive tests. So for 4 out of the 8 cognitive tests, the population, the sample that we had, performed better compared to the high-performing population that CogState provided with their normative data. Okay, so with this, the limitations, with any project, any study, any research, you're always gonna look at these limitations, and I think this is just the part of the learning and adapting and then moving forward in terms of how we can learn from this and modify and adapt it for next time. It was a small sample size, despite looking at previous research where they used similar sample sizes. This was still considered, 36 participants. A larger sample size would have been much better, obviously. A more proportionate distribution between males and females could have given us richer data, I believe. The sample, as indicated when I reviewed the HRV compared to the normative data and the cognitive performance test scores compared to normative data, was really high-performing, experienced, fit soldiers. The high normal HRV and both the cognitive test scores, it could potentially insinuate a possible ceiling effect. And what I mean by that is, at what point does HRV no longer have an impact on cognitive performance? That's still really unknown in the research. We know higher is better, but after, when someone reaches 100 HRV, does it really not have an impact on cognitive performance? Potentially, we don't know that. The participants were more similar than dissimilar, and so that was a limitation. As I mentioned previously, we can only test one participant at a time, and some of the cognitive tests were less than a 5-minute duration, and that prevents us from comparing the cognitive test to the HRV in the moment. So for HRV recordings, it needs to have a minimum of 5-minute duration epoch. So if the test was only 2 minutes and the HRV, you couldn't compare that. You needed to have a 5-minute cognitive test compared with a 5-minute epoch of HRV. Okay. So in terms of implications for the research and theories, the 3 main theories that this lit review was based upon was general adaptation syndrome, overtraining syndrome, and allostatic theory. I'm not going to go into detail. You can look into chapter 2 if you really want to learn more about GIS, OTS, and allostatic theory. But the overall general synopsis is moderate bouts of stress, good, healthy, and needed for optimal performance. However, in terms of maintaining homeostasis and adaptability, the human body can only take so much. And so extended chronic stress can really impact not only heart rate variability, but cognitive performance over time. It is also indicated in the research that those individuals with a high parasympathetic tone, so that's that rest and digest wing of the autonomic nervous system, may have more reserve in the reserve. So that person might be starting with a full tank of gas instead of a half a tank of gas. And so that just indicates that that person might have more resources to allocate during a performance test. In this case, it was cognitive testing. They may be less vulnerable to stress if they have more to start with. And that was clearly the case if we look at the numbers for this particular sample. They had higher parasympathetic tone, more in the reserves. The impact that cognitive load had on HRV, both in the research and then also in this study, was duplicated. And it was shown that, again, greater self-regulation prior to a performance task tends to trend towards optimal cognitive performance, and then post testing, HRV tends to go up. And that's just indicative of energy management and sustainability in terms of nervous system regulation. However, though, there was no relationship that existed between HRV and cognitive performance test scores, and so that refutes several theories that suggest otherwise. So recommendations. What I had mentioned earlier in terms of diverse and larger active duty military samples, I would recommend that anyone who's interested in taking this topic to the next level, trying to get a larger sample size, perhaps at the battalion or brigade size element. I would continue at short duration HRV recordings. You'll see in the research that protocols go up to as long as 24 hours in duration. And I don't think that's necessary when you're looking at performance psychology, performance enhancement. If it was more of a clinical study, the 24-hour Holter recordings would be more appropriate. I would stick with a 5-minute sitting upright protocol. You could potentially eliminate the 5-minute supine resting, but you do get a little bit of the good variation in terms of the tilt test protocol. I would also recommend 5-minute epochs during cognitive battery. So considering just looking at shortening the cognitive testing with potentially, 5 cognitive tests, each 5 minutes, at least 5 minutes in duration, so you can compare HRV in the moment to a specific cognitive test. And that would make the test, instead of 45 minutes long, that test would be 25 minutes long, no more than 30 minutes. Recommend also continuing to minimize those confounding variables. HRV is very sensitive to those factors that we previously discussed. So making sure that's part of the protocol is really imperative. I discussed with my committee when I was going through this that moving forward, it may be a good idea to do 2 things. Have a control group to assess the impact of intervention. So training a group of soldiers on heart rate variability, cognitive enhancement strategies for stress management, but coupling this with maybe a more longitudinal study. There is currently no protocol that exists that monitors heart rate variability or flags overtraining syndrome in the military. So I close with, where is it most relevant to use HRV as a predictor for military service members? That question is really still unknown, and perhaps cognitive performance testing is not the venue. Perhaps it's just, or perhaps you just need a larger sample, a more diverse sample. Perhaps, though, HRV is more suitable in physical environments that are longer in duration. So, for example, across the military training cycle, prior to deploying, while they're deployed, and then when they get back for their reset. That might be more applicable, and that longitudinal study could help with that. I do believe it is very important to study both types of samples, and what I mean by that is it's important to study experienced experts, but also look at novice newcomers in the military. So while this group tended to be a little bit more experienced, a little bit more vetted and healthier, I think it's important to maybe look at basic trainees, your average Joes, and that can provide the literature with more, plethora of resources and data, enrich the data a bit. I think with a larger sample, those mean differences will start to become a little bit more richer and provide more critical information to the community. Overall, I think this study did contribute to a better understanding of HRV and cognitive performance health. And I think it offers a starting point. It's just a starting point. It was my attempt to really give back to the community that's given me such a rewarding career so far. And the lessons learned, I think, that were captured in this small scale study provide an avenue for research that's possibly funded on a much larger scale to reinvestigate this with a larger sample. So that is my contact information. You'll see that the UMI number is indicated right here on the slide. And if I'll open it up for any questions or comments.
Hi everyone, this is Polly.
Excuse me, please, hello, whoever's talking right now, please post your question in the chat box because it's really tough for us to kind of manage these, and then I'll introduce those one at a time. So sorry for interrupting you there, but if you could post it up. Thank you, MR, for a great presentation. I think the end of your presentation was the question that I had, which is where do you go from here with this? Is there a possibility of a follow-up study or a longer study or a study sponsored by the military to do this with a larger group?
I think that's an excellent question. So I work for SAIC, a government contracting company that's heavily embedded in like Army research and development. And that's something that I've considered pitching this idea to their research and development team. Right now, the big push in the military is this like suicide prevention. It's more of a clinical standpoint. It's more, resilience training, things like that, which is imperative. But I believe that, yeah, in order for this to really get some teeth to, the sample size does need to increase and it needs to be funded.
Right, right. So that's the grant that you're going to be writing to try to get that funding.
Put that on my to-do list, right?
Right. Listen, we have a couple great questions in the chat room. First, have you done any work with any of the other branches of the military?
So the organization that I serve right now, every once in a while you'll run into other, different tiers and different service members. It's a little bit more integrated where I'm at because I'm in the Northern Virginia area and DC region. So sometimes it's Air Force, sometimes it's the Navy. It's primarily the Army though. That being said, all branches of the military right now are using sports psychology consultants. So I have a colleague that works down at Virginia Beach, a colleague in New Mexico working with the Air Force. So
what you're saying is that this concept is something that's been embraced by the military as a very logical pathway to improving the health and service capabilities of members, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Dr. Rice asked a question about how the study could be used with a different population, like an athletic or other kind of performer population.
Yeah, I think that's great. So when we were doing the lit review, when I was doing the lit review, it was usually like a pre-season intervention. And then monitoring during and then after. So on a smaller scale, say you're working, with a track team or basketball team, you can use HRV as just a diagnostic, a monitoring tool during the off season, and then during the season easily incorporate some form of, if it doesn't have to be cognitive testing, but it could be some sort of intervention technique during and then post. For the most part, though, with athletes, it's used as a diagnostic monitoring tool for overtraining syndrome.
Right, as opposed to a readiness preparation for military exercise as you're using it, right?
Yeah, and I think there's two ways you can look at this. You can look at it in terms of performance enhancement, but you could also look at it as health and wellness, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of times we get hung up on, well, someone had a low heart rate variability, but they're like the MVP. That's the case sometimes. Sometimes somebody is going to be the person that's a hard charger. The question becomes, how long can they sustain that?
Right, right.
So in terms of athlete development, that overtraining aspect is big. And strength and conditioning coaches a lot of times will monitor teams' heart rate variability, and it allows the strength and conditioning coach to taper or modify their program.
Right. So a lot of applicability. Dr. Esteville asked an interesting question. She asked you to elaborate on how much impact variability in the subject's length and quality of sleep had on their cognitive testing in HRV. Did you find a relationship there?
So it was a self-report measure that we used, asking them to report, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is their sleep quality, and then on average, how many hours of sleep do they receive? And so this particular sample reported, average to above average sleep, which surprised me, because I work with a lot of these individuals. I'm like, really? You sure? But the research will show that poor sleep quality and quantity, but more so quality of sleep, is indicative of an overactive sympathetic drive. So that brings in a whole other topic of like post-traumatic stress, the relationship between post-traumatic stress and sleep and heart rate variability, which I think is a whole other topic area that we can spend hours talking about. But yeah, those that have poorer sleep tend to have lower heart rate variability.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Holmes asked a question of what are you using your degree in research for currently? And you might want to just say a little bit about the Tier 1 and what kind of work you're doing.
Sure. So right now, in terms of research, I'm not currently working on any current research projects. There is discussion about bringing this topic area to the ASP conference, which is the Applied Sports Psychology governing body. And that conference is held, once a year. So there's sort of this talk of potentially bringing this topic to a conference and presenting on it. In terms of my LLC, that's Tier 1 Mindset. It's looking at taking this work to more systematically to athletes, ranging anywhere from like high school to the professional level. And I do consults, excuse me, on the side, whether that be virtual, one-on-one sessions. Right now, I'm working with a handful of youth sport gymnastics, youth sport gymnasts, things like that. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, Dr. Rice made a comment. He said, so this would be could possibly be a good technique to use with distance runners who need to monitor that ability to maintain homeostasis over a long period of time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We found this with any sort of endurance athlete in the research. Even if you take a soldier out to a 12-hour training exercise and we monitor their HRV, you'll notice those that start out super fast, pedal to the metal up front, they burn out too quickly. And so by the 8th hour of a 12-hour operation, they're exhausted. Not just physically, but mentally. So for an endurance athlete, ultramarathoner, absolutely. Managing your energy, practicing mindfulness, and it also, goes hand in hand with nutrition and hydration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And I just another comment that was posted here. Thanks for your wonderful presentation. It's greatly appreciated. And I believe your research is a wonderful contribution to the field of military health psychology, or health and military psychology. So I think lots of people are seeing the applicability of your research. So any other questions from our audience? We're just getting near the end of our time, but we have time for another question or two if it comes up. Or MR, if you want to add anything.
No, I think I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes. I was getting tired of not seeing any research specifically outside of the tactical training environment. And so I was looking at someone at rest and how that impacts the community. So I look forward to just continuing to build the database with this type of stuff, because it equips coaches like myself with validated tools and techniques to give to the service members that can not only impact them from a performance enhancement standpoint, but also back home.